One MP, who's pretty independently minded, who perhaps might have something to say about this, is Adam Holloway, Conservative Member of Parliament for Gravesham. Now, whenever Adam comes on this show, he's nearly always travelling to some part of the world, and indeed, he joins us tonight from the port of Odessa in Ukraine. Adam, good evening.
Good evening. It's not that I'm always travelling, Nigel. It's just that I always speak to you when I am travelling. And on a more serious note, what happens here in Ukraine is about the most important thing for my constituents right now, given the extreme risks to global peace that this place represents. So, this is important.
Adam, I was not accusing you of skiving for one moment, and you're quite right. What happens in Ukraine, and indeed the developing relationship between Putin and the Chinese Communist Party, worries me deeply, and I'll come to Ukraine and ask you some questions about what's going on in Bakhmut in a moment. But first, these levels of legal net migration, Adam, they're completely and hopelessly out of control. Why are you guys on the back benches not raising your voices?
I'd go further. It's completely insane. I mean, who would have thought that a Conservative government would be drawing millions more people into the higher rate tax bracket? Who would think that a Conservative government was presiding over effectively uncontrolled immigration? I mean, of course, the boats, which you, by the way, have done so much to highlight, those are big numbers, but 46,000 is a lot smaller number than nearly 1 million. I mean, if net migration over the last few years has been about 300,000 a year, now that's like 5 parliamentary constituencies of new people every year. I mean, over 10 years, that's nearly 50 parliamentary constituencies in terms of people. So your point, I think you said it earlier, is actually very well made. We have, in my constituency, what are the biggest issues at the moment? The biggest, of course, is housing. I have a member of my team virtually working full-time, helping to get people GP appointments. You go to the hospitals, there are huge numbers of people. I mean, you scale your immigration to your public services and the needs of your labour market, but you take control of it.
Adam, I get all this, and I'm delighted that you get it and that you're prepared to speak out. But why are so many Conservatives seemingly terrified to talk about this issue? What the hell's going on?
Do you know, I really don't know. And when I spoke to your producer earlier, because I'm obviously slightly disengaged being here and having travelled here, but it is extraordinary. Having said that, I know that at least a group of us are asking to see the Home Secretary next week, because, it's not just about the Tory party's electoral prospects that are shattered by this, but it's actually about, the shape and the feel of our country going forward. It's about public services, and every single MP, not just Conservative, should be looking at this and should. I mean, what's the point of being in office if you don't do the right thing when you actually have the power? It's quite bizarre to me.
Quite. And as for taking back control, as for regaining, real control, genuine control over our borders, frankly, it's turned into a farce. Now, Adam, if we read our British newspapers and listen to reports, we're told that the Ukrainian army is making advances around Bakhmut in particular. We're told the Russians are taking very heavy casualties. We're told a major spring offensive is about to be underway. Do you see any prospect of this deadlock being broken?
Okay, let me put it like this. So I've literally, in the last half an hour, I've come from a hospital about 25 minutes walk that way, the military hospital, and I was talking to a loyal subject of Her Majesty, who's one of the British foreign fighters, and he's in there wounded. He was hit by shrapnel from a bomblet dropped from a drone. Very nasty injury in his torso, lots of bits of metal in there. And he was saying it's just unbelievable, the weight, the limitless weight of Russian artillery. For every 50 shells that the Russians put down, they do 5. So that they'll be in a building, they'll attack the Russians. Within a minute, endless complete barrages of stuff. So the point that he and indeed the Ukrainians make is that this is why it's so important to have this long-range artillery, because obviously if a Storm Shadow or a HIMARS can hit a depot with 10,000 Russian artillery shells, that's 10,000 artillery shells that aren't being fired on people like him. So to your point about the offensive, this is why the long-range stuff is so important, because it means you can hit Russian supply chain, the baggage chain, if you like, before it actually gets onto the battlefield. And that then gives space for things like the new tanks to roll forward and take ground and hopefully punch through and isolate the Crimea and separate the Russian body of troops and their supply lines.
Well, you say hopefully, but history does suggest that even when the Russians are up against it, they tend to just keep on going. I mean, I personally think the stalemate could go on for a very, very long time. And isn't the concern now that Putin now effectively is really a proxy for China?
I don't know if it's that strong, because I think China's got its own red lines in terms of the way Putin has to behave. But of course, it must suit China to have us involved in this. But I remember last time you kindly had me on and we spoke about Bakhmut, and you and I were both mystified as to why they were bothering to do that, and I suggested they should perhaps bypass it. But actually, I've been thinking about it and talking to people since then. And of course, if you're defending, you can do a lot more damage to the people who are attacking you. So Bakhmut, from the Ukrainian point of view, is great, because those shells, Russian shells, are being used in huge numbers. And whilst the Ukrainians are indeed losing people, the Russians are losing a bit more. I mean, I just saw a couple of hours ago the latest, statistics published by the Ukrainians, and they think that yesterday they killed 510 Russians and 2 tanks and 33 artillery pieces. So the point about Bakhmut and other places where the Ukrainians are deliberately defending and bringing the Russians on is to deplete Russian stock.
And yet, Adam, it's that sort of war of attrition. It's sort of 1916 onwards to 1918. It's horrible. Adam, as ever, fascinating report from Ukraine. And I want you to make my viewers a promise that you come back next week and please give the government a hard time on these immigration figures.